Hello and welcome to this pre-recorded feedback event for the Digital Creative Media Production 2015 examination for Unit 8, 21647. Natalie Proctor is the lead examiner for BTEC First in Creative Digital Media Production, Unit 8, Media Industry in Context. To help you get the most out of this feedback, you may want to have the following documents handy, as we will refer to them during the session. This includes the question paper which is used throughout this presentation. You may want to ensure you have the following resources available during this session. Here are the aims and objectives of today's session. You will receive feedback on performance of learners in the June 2015 examination series. Consider questions where significant numbers of learners underperformed and possible reasons why. Discuss the lead examiner's report. Consider delivery strategies and share good practice. Address common issues. Find out about further support available. The unit overview provided within the specification provides the basis for the general content that the exam will cover. Unit 8 is designed to introduce learners to the varying and diverse types of companies and structures that exist within the digital creative media sector, and the size, scope and structure of these, emphasizing the complex and evolving nature of the sector. Learners are also introduced to professional working practices and will develop an understanding of the legal and ethical constraints within which media professionals operate. This includes regulation of media industries and means of redress. Learners will also gain an understanding of the advantages and disadvantages of different contracts of employment and recruitment practices. Assessment is broken down into 3 learning aims. Learning Aim A is designed to help learners understand the organization of media industries. Learning Aim B aims to provide an understanding of professional working practices. Learning Aim C allows learners to gain knowledge about employment in the digital media sectors. Assessment of the learning aims takes the form of a timed, externally assessed component. Here is an example of a response to question 10b. This is an example of a good response for this question. The candidate has provided 2 distinct responses to the question and has considered platforms through which the BBC could deliver the content. In addition, the candidate has maintained consideration for the target audience within the response, showing a greater understanding of the way in which media producers consider the construction and delivery of the content. The exemplification is both reasoned and justified. When delivering the content of the specification, it is important for teachers to ensure that they provide learners with a range of relevant examples from within the public broadcasting sector on which to base their investigations, and allow them to gain an understanding of how these providers work within their public service remit. Learners should be encouraged to discuss these in detail, considering all factors that may affect the production of content and its relevance to consumers. Overall, this question was generally well answered by candidates, and many were able to identify at least one means by which the BBC could promote education and literacy. Many of the responses related to candidates' own experience of BBC products and services, which were no less relevant and still reflected an understanding of the BBC's public service role and function. Unfortunately, some candidates are still confused about the BBC's ability to advertise, and therefore responses that contained an element of the BBC advertising services in a wider context were often not rewarded. Similarly, as the BBC has a remit to provide local services, many candidates felt that the BBC should visit schools, etc., and ask them what they wanted. Whilst this may be seen as valuable research by the company, it is not in line with what was being asked within the question itself. Candidates should be encouraged to read through the question carefully, in order to understand fully what is being asked of them, and what information may be required within the response. Candidates generally performed well in this question, and showed an understanding of the role and function of the BBC. It was evident that centres have discussed public service broadcasting, particularly the BBC, in some detail, and that the company's values and remit have been understood by learners. Most candidates were able to provide some examples of education content, drawing from current practice and existing products, with an explanation of why and how these may promote literacy. Some responses could be improved by candidates providing more evaluative and elaborated responses, or imaginative and elucidated ideas for content. For this question, the candidate seems to have provided a rather brief response to the question. However, the content of the response is highly relevant and focused, and the candidate maintains a clear argument that contains both positive and negative viewpoints, albeit slightly unbalanced. It is clear that the candidate understands what censorship is and how it affects both consumers and producers alike. They have also applied this specifically to the industry in question, and questioned the nature of censorship within a wider context. This candidate has not been awarded full marks, but has performed within the boundaries of the upper mark bands. As there is an overall lack of balance in the response, then a best fit model should be applied, and the candidate has been awarded for what they have included, and not penalised for omission. With issues such as censorship, it is important for learners to engage with a range of thoughts and opinions, and be provided with up-to-date discussions that are relevant and meaningful. Many learners will have strong feelings and opinions on this particular topic, as it affects their own personal consumption habits, particularly in a day and age where access to the internet means there are very few taboos, and previously controlled content can be more readily accessed. It is important for learners to be able to take a rational and considered approach to the topic. Whilst learners' opinions are valued and should be taken into account, it is important that they are able to provide a balanced response to the question, using relevant illustrative examples. Overall, due to the reasons previously mentioned, this question was generally well answered by most candidates. However, candidates again lost marks due to a lack of evaluative and considered commentary within the response, with commentary tending towards personal opinion or emotional responses. Generally, learners that were awarded grades in the lower mark bands tended to offer one opinion with limited exemplification. As in the example here, where the candidate has focused on the removal of content as both a positive and a negative point, and has failed to offer a reasonable explanation as to how this could be achieved, and what the overarching effect would be. The key message with this type of question is balance, and candidates should be able to consider the pros and cons of each point that they make, and provide some form of exemplification. Learners should be encouraged to undertake evaluative work whenever possible, both in relation to the topics being studied and their own working practices. Candidates showed an understanding of the advantages and disadvantages of censorship within this specific sector. Evaluative techniques were generally appropriate. However, there was often a lack of balance within the responses, with only one viewpoint being fully considered and discussed. Candidates should always be encouraged to consider all factors and opinions, and to discuss them within their responses. Most candidates showed an understanding of key issues and debates, especially those relating to freedom of expression and protection of minors. Responses could be improved by better use of language and media terminology, and more detailed and relevant exemplification. It would be beneficial at this point to undertake an activity that will allow you to apply the mark scheme to a learner response. Look at the example above, and using the mark scheme provided, decide what mark you think should be awarded. Also make a note of why you are awarding that mark. Use the descriptors from the mark scheme to help you do this. You may wish to pause the video to carry out the activity. Six marks have been awarded for this response. The candidate makes some sophisticated points, which might suggest a mark in Mark Band 3. However, not all points are completely relevant to the situation in the question, and there is occasionally a lack of focus. That said, there is sufficient argument made on both sides to award a mark at the top of Mark Band 2. Again, it is important to remember that candidates should be awarded for what has been included, and not penalized for omissions. The candidates that performed well in this question understood the advantages and disadvantages of censorship, and were able to apply them to the context of the scenario. They used correct terminology, either throughout their response or when required. More successful candidates were able to provide some reasoned and justifiable exemplification within their response, and often provided a recent real-world example to emphasize how practice is applied within the sector. The highest achieving candidates identified at least one distinct advantage and disadvantage, or provided sound counter-arguments as justification for each. For this question, the candidate has offered a valid response to the question, which is in line with the requirements of the specification and the demands of the question. Whilst this was only a one-mark question that generally required recall on the part of the candidate, there was often some confusion as to what was being asked. This will be discussed in more detail later, but it is important to note that learners should be able to differentiate between the reasons for legislation existing and the consequences of failing to uphold it. Here, the candidate has tried in a number of ways to respond to the question, but has failed to provide an accurate or valid reason for having health and safety laws in place. It is worth noting that part of the reason why this response is so confused related to poor use of grammar and sentence structure. The candidate doesn't fully articulate the point they are trying to make. It is not clear what can happen to co-workers in a health and safety context, or why that could cause the company a loss of revenue. For example, the response could imply that a worker could be late to work, causing delays in production and costing the company money. But that is not a health and safety issue, and therefore would not be relevant. There is too much inference here, and therefore a mark cannot be awarded. Overall, most candidates were aware of health and safety legislation and why it exists. Whilst many candidates were aware that the legislation was intended to protect the workforce, many responses related solely to the prevention of litigation. Higher performing candidates were also able to identify situations that could be considered hazardous within their responses, further evidencing their understanding of the topic. Responses could be improved by greater understanding on behalf of candidates of the difference between protecting workers and protecting companies from lawsuits. The latter not being the reason why health and safety legislation exists, but rather a potential repercussion were a company to fail in its duty of care towards its workforce. Responses could also be improved by better use of language. Poor use of grammar can lead to confused responses. Use of relevant media terminology is also important to reflect candidates' understanding of media-related issues. Here we are looking at another 8-mark question, which allows candidates to show a greater understanding of the topics covered within the specification. This candidate has been awarded 7 marks for their response, and they have provided a considered and well-reasoned discussion of the topic, providing exemplification where appropriate. The candidate has considered cause and effect within the response, and the implications of the potential growth of the company on production output, distribution, and audience share. It is also possible to see here that the candidate has made annotations above the question as an aide-memoire, which has allowed them to provide a more balanced and fluid response, which contains a reasoned argument. The candidate has not received full marks, as the response tends to become slightly confused and repetitive towards the end. There is an overall lack of rounding off and fully concluding the discussion. Whilst this question was generally well answered, some candidates lost marks due to poor use of language and grammar, which resulted in the reasoning behind the discussion being lost. This candidate has resorted to bullet pointing at the end of the response, and therefore they have failed to offer a full and balanced discussion with suitable exemplification. Whilst bullet pointing is seen as a valid means of recording responses, it is not beneficial to candidates to do so for these types of questions, as they are automatically limiting themselves and the amount of marks they can receive, as they are not providing reasons, justifications, or discussions around the topic. Centres should ensure that candidates are aware of how bullet pointing can affect their overall performance. Candidates tended to perform well when they attempted to fully respond to all parts of the question and avoided the overuse of bullet points, offered a balanced response that provided a range of suitable suggestions as to why branding is important. Most candidates were aware of what a brand or brand name and image is, and why and how they are used by many different companies to attract consumers. Responses could be improved by better use of language and terminology, as well as grammar and punctuation, to ensure readability for the examiner. The candidate has been awarded 4 marks for this response. They have identified 2 ways in which piracy impacts on the film industry, and the explanations provided are reasonable expectations of what could happen if the industry continues to lose revenue in this way. This question was generally well answered, as this topic is one that many candidates have personal experience of, as most will have downloaded films themselves and will have seen the many piracy warnings on the internet. Some candidates lost marks because they were unable to offer more than one reason or explanation outside of loss of revenue and less films being made. This response has gained less marks, as only one reason and explanation has been offered. The second response does not relate to the question, but is more an explanation of how difficult it is to control and police piracy. Again, it is important to reflect that poor use of language is affecting quality of candidates' responses, and thus causing them to lose marks. An examiner cannot infer a response, and can only award marks for responses where the meaning and context is explicit. Candidates tended to perform well in this question and had a good understanding of the negative effects on the industry. Many candidates were able to offer 2 distinct responses with reasonable explanations. Most candidates were also able to apply their knowledge to the wider context. Overall responses could be improved, ensuring candidates understand the wider implications of illegal file sharing outside of loss of revenue. We are now going to carry out another activity. Once I have summarized the task, you may want to pause the presentation in order to carry it out. Look at the example above, and using the mark scheme provided, decide what mark you think should be awarded. Also make a note of why you are awarding that mark. Use the descriptors from the mark scheme to help you do this. This response has been awarded 2 marks. The candidate has provided 1 valid point which has been sufficiently explained. The second point is, in essence, a repetition of the first, and therefore no marks have been awarded for this. It is worth noting that either of the responses could have received 2 marks. However, due to repetition, it is only possible to award a total of 2 marks overall. In these instances, the examiner will always be looking to mark positively, and will award what is there and not penalize what isn't. On this question, successful candidates showed a clear understanding of the impact of illegal file sharing on the film industry, offered a valid explanation within their response, identified more than one impact, which were distinct from each other. The candidate has failed to offer a valid response to the question, and seems confused as to what could be considered reasonable measures in these circumstances. The candidate has failed to realize that the media industry cannot regulate the internet, nor can they apply better security measures to illegal download sites, which is where the majority of file sharing takes place. The second response is too vague, as it doesn't specify which file sharing should be more secure. Candidates were sometimes confused about what constituted a feasible preventative measure that the industry would actually be able to implement. Some candidates were under the impression that media companies were able to shut down the internet or websites. Many candidates showed a lack of understanding of legislation and how it could work in a company's favor. Many believed companies were able to make laws. Responses could be improved by candidates gaining greater understanding of legislation and how laws are brought into effect and who enforces them. The candidate has not really maximized on their potential to gain marks and has only offered one response to the question. This is sadly quite common, and candidates should be encouraged to answer all questions as fully as possible, as by not responding, they are automatically forfeiting marks. This candidate's first point is very strong and well thought out, and could easily have been moved forward or expanded on in the second response. This response is stronger, but is also rather repetitive in the sense that the candidate has, in essence, said the same thing twice. The additional mark has been awarded for the learner's ability to identify audience segmentation and public awareness issues, rather than the explanations provided, which are not as well-rounded as they could be. Candidates tended to offer repetitive responses relating to younger audiences. Many candidates failed to offer an explanation that was distinct from the previous response, or that was fully developed and well-rounded. Responses could be improved by ensuring that candidates provide more exemplification in their responses, which reflects their understanding of the topic. Candidates should be made aware of reasons for warnings and classification within a range of media sectors and across a range of products. We are now going to carry out another activity. Once I have summarized the task, you may want to pause the presentation in order to carry it out. Look at the example above, and using the mark scheme provided, decide what mark you think should be awarded. Also make a note of why you are awarding that mark. Use the descriptors from the mark scheme to help you do this. No mark was awarded for this response, as the candidate has failed to offer any valid benefits to the employer. Whilst it could be argued that fixed-term contracts are cost-effective, the candidate has failed to fully and effectively identify this in their response. On this question, successful candidates understood that fixed-term contracts provided flexibility for the employer and allowed them to change or refresh the workforce as required. Realized that the benefits being asked for were employer and not employee benefits. Were aware that financial considerations were important and were able to indicate this effectively in their response. We are now going to carry out another activity. Once I have summarized the task, you may want to pause the presentation in order to carry it out. Look at the example above, and using the mark scheme provided, decide what mark you think should be awarded. Also make a note of why you are awarding that mark. Use the descriptors from the mark scheme to help you do this. For this response, only one mark was awarded for the first response, which relates to the nature of networking, allowing employers to take on staff on recommendation from other respected employers. No mark was given for the second point, as the reference to experience is not relevant to the question. Whilst it is appreciated that networking may provide experienced employees, so can other methods of recruitment, and it is not exclusive to this particular method. It is also worth noting that some networking can be nepotistic and may result in a non-experienced person gaining employment due to family connections. Understood the difference between networking within the industry as opposed to social networking. Identified that recommendations were an important aspect of networking. Were able to relate their responses specifically to recruitment methods. Used appropriate media terminology. I would like to take a moment to summarize some of the common issues. Firstly, we noticed some candidates failing to provide balanced responses to evaluative questions. This could be addressed by providing learners with scenarios in which they undertake similar evaluative activities. There has also been a misinterpretation or misunderstanding of the demands of questions. Candidates should be encouraged to practice good exam techniques and to read through questions carefully. There was a lack of knowledge of certain key concepts or areas of the specification in some instances. It is important when delivering the specification to take a systematic approach and ensure full content coverage. The overall use of media terminology within responses was inconsistent. Candidates should have a sound grasp of media concepts and use appropriate vocabulary at all times. Many candidate responses exhibited a poor use of grammar and vocabulary, which affected quality and readability. Focus on wider key skills. Finally, I would like to share some ideas with you relating to delivery strategies and best practice. It is important that the unit content is delivered in the same way as other units, and teachers should avoid teaching to the exam. Learners should be provided with a range of tasks and activities to undertake that will conceptualize the content and key concepts. Individual and group activities and investigations should be encouraged. Learners should record and write up their findings, and focus should be placed on balanced and evaluative commentaries. A range of assessment tasks could assist learners with their skills building and allow them to reflect their knowledge and understanding of the unit content. There is a wide range of resources available from Pearson, which are designed to assist you with delivery of the specification. The teaching and assessment packs contain sample assessment materials and past exam papers, and mark schemes are available on the Pearson website. Each question on the paper has been commented upon in the lead examiner's report. This is another resource for you to use to help understand the requirements of each question, and to see what sort of responses were given by candidates and how they were awarded marks. Some of the information from it has been used in this presentation, and if you are able to spend some time reading it, I am sure it will help you gain further understanding. The report can be given to learners, so they can see for themselves what is required for the different types of questions, and how they can be awarded marks. For further support and feedback relating to this external assessment, please visit our dedicated BTEC results web pages via the link shown here. There are a range of further training events available, which will also be useful in providing support and guidance with the delivery of this qualification as a whole, and these can be accessed via the link shown here. My BTEC pages. And finally, to access lots of useful support and resources for digital creative media production, make sure you visit the subject page by clicking on this image. Just email teachingict@pearson.com to join the mailing list. We hope you have found this session useful. Please take the time to complete our short online survey regarding this recording, as we very much value your feedback. Thank you for your time.